Hi class, and welcome to chapter 4, supply and demand. And this particular section is all about supply. So remember, we're on chapter 4. Market forces of supply and demand. This is supply. We've already done demand, and then we'll do equilibrium as a separate video. So the quantity supplied. The quantity supplied is literally any good is the amount that the seller is willing and able to sell. So as a seller, let's say we're selling, I don't know, Post-it notes. We're selling Post-it notes. So we have to decide how many we're going to be willing to sell at every single price. In other words, we're going to look at our costs and we're going to decide what we're willing to sell. The law of supply is a claim that the quantity supplied of a good rises as the price of that good rises, other things being equal. For instance, if you know that the price is going to be higher, you know you can make more money. So now you're going to sell 2 Post-it notes versus 1. If we look at this in terms of our chocolate, and now we're not the consumer anymore, we're the manufacturer, and we're Chuck's Chocolate, a firm that produces and sells chocolate bars. When the price of a chocolate bar rises, Chuck's going to produce more chocolate bars. So this is a direct relationship versus the inverse relationship. So when we start to look at the price schedule for Chuck, Chuck can decide at every single price point, like for instance, $2, how many he's willing to sell. So at $2, he's willing to sell 500. If the price drops to $1.60, he's only willing to sell 400. If the price drops to $1.20, he's willing to sell 300. If the price drops to 80, he's willing to sell 200. And as the price drops to 40, he's willing to sell 100. So as the price goes down, the quantity supplied goes down. This is the supply schedule, very similar to the demand schedule, but now we are looking at suppliers, thus the supply schedule, whereas before we were looking at demand, which was consumers. You can translate this just like we translated the demand schedule into a supply schedule. So remember back to Chuck, at $2, he was willing to supply 500. There's one of his points. We also knew that at 160, he was willing to supply 400, 0.2. At 120, he was willing to supply 30, 0.3. At 80, he was willing to supply 200. And then at 40 cents, he was willing to supply 100. We can add those all together and create a supply curve. Supply schedule, as we talked about, is a table that shows that relationship. So back to lattes, Starbucks is obviously a manufacturer, obviously a supplier, and they're going to decide how many lattes they're willing to supply at every price point. And they're going to obey the law of supply, hopefully. So this particular Starbucks has decided that at the price of 0, they're going to supply no lattes. At the price of $1, they can supply 3. At the price of $2, they can supply 6. At the price of $3, they can supply 9. At the price of $4, 12. $5, 15. $6, 18. So as the price has gone up, so has the quantity supplied, a direct relationship. Starbucks is following the law of supply. We can take that and plot it. So we can say, okay, at 0 and at 0, Starbucks is going to supply 0. At $1, they're going to supply 3. At $2, they're going to supply 6. At $3, they're going to supply 9. At $4, they're willing to supply 12. At $5, they're willing to supply 15. And at $6, they're willing to supply 18. We can then take those points, draw the curve, and we now have the supply curve for Starbucks. Notice there's a direct relationship. As the price goes up, the quantity supply goes up. Now, that was the individual one supplier, Starbucks. So if we were to assume the entire coffee market had two suppliers and they were Peet's and Starbucks, we could create the market supply curve based on what Peet's was willing to sell at every price point and what Starbucks was. So remember, we had Starbucks and we knew that Starbucks at 0 was willing to sell 0. And Peet, no surprise, is also willing to sell 0. So if we add 0 plus 0, we get 0. At $1, Starbucks was willing to sell 3. Peet's only 2. So 3 plus 2 equals 5. At $2, Starbucks is willing to sell 6. Peet's is willing to sell 4. The market quantity is 10. At $3, Starbucks was willing to sell 9. Peet's is willing to sell 6, so the market quantity is 15. At $4, 12, 8, 20. $5, 15 for Starbucks, 10 for Peet's. Market quantity is 25. And at 6, Starbucks was willing to sell 18, Peet's 12, 18 plus 12 equals 30. So what you see here is that Peet has a different schedule than Starbucks. In other words, Peet may only be selling 2 at the dollar and only 4 at $2. And 6, this is based on their individual supply chains, etc. The market is adding those all up and creating what they consider to be the market demand schedule, very similar to what the consumers are doing. We can translate this just like we just translated the one curve into the market supply curve. Plotting the dollar, 0, 0. Probably should look that all the way down here. $1, $5. There's your first point right there. $2, 10. $3, 15. $4, 20. $5, 25. $6, 30. Make a nice little chart. So the law of supply simply stating that the price of a good or service rises, the quantity supplied of that good also rises. Both go up. Likewise, if the price of the good falls, the quantity supplied of that good also falls. This is taking a look at how price affects the quantity supplied. But just like the demand curve, we have that nice little statement, all other things being equal. Those all other things are non-price determinants. Non-price determinants of supply are things like input prices. What are input prices? Well, to a latte, inputs would be things like coffee and cups and syrups and milk. Technology, directly associated. Well, what's technology? Technology is things like better espresso machines, better frothers, etc. The number of sellers. How many people are in the market? Because remember, there's only so much demand for coffee at that price. But the more sellers there are, the more or the less each one can supply. And expectations, very similar to our curve. For the supply curve, expectations also affect the demand curve. So when we start to look at this, we're starting to think about things like, as we shift the supply curve, what can possibly increase the supply? So any change that increases the quantity supplied at every single price is going to shift the curve to the right. Any decrease in supply, that means any change that decreases the quantity supplied at every price is going to shift the supply curve to the left. So here we are. So if we look at this in terms of the supply curve, Anything that increases the overall supply of, for instance, in this case, ice cream cones, is going to shift it to the right. This is an increase in supply. Anything that shifts it to the left is a decrease in supply, based on those expectations we looked at before. So, input prices. What kind of input prices? They could be wages. Remember, consumers are not only people who buy things, but they're also labor, right? They have a resource. Remember back to chapter 2. We have resources, and individuals own resources. One of the resources we own is our labor. Our labor is paid in wages. Wages are an input price. Raw materials are also an input price. So if you're making lattes, you've got the wages of the baristas, you've got the price, you've got the wages of management, and then you have the price of the raw materials that go into it. A fall in input prices makes production more profitable. If indeed the cost of milk or coffee goes down, every single cup of coffee you make is more profitable. So it will make it so that you can supply a greater quantity at each price, and it shifts the supply curve right. In our example of the chocolate bars, one of the inputs into bars is obviously chocolate, and chocolate comes from the seed of the cocoa tree. That is a cocoa tree seed. If the seed prices increase, then the cost of producing candy bars would increase as well. So at every single price point, it would cost them more to produce, so they can literally produce less. So what it will do is it will shift the supply curve inward. So in our example, at $1.20, before the supply of coffee was 300. Because cocoa has gone up in price, now the quantity supplied is 200. It shifted the supply curve inward, and the same thing would be true at every single price point. The quantity supplied is less now than it was before. Technology determines how much inputs are required to produce an output. Because if you think about it, technology is helping you do what? It's helping you use your inputs more efficiently. So any kind of cost savings technology will improve your production. So it will cause the prices to what? Fall. So what happens? And it shifts the demand curve outward. So let's look at some examples there. So what could be a technology change that you could have in the chocolate bar business? Well, what about the fact that every single chocolate bar has to be wrapped? And if you use fewer packaging materials, you'd be able to offer more candy bars. So if there's a technology that wraps the candy bars faster and uses fewer packaging materials, then all of a sudden now, that technology is making it what? Less costly to produce each chocolate bar. So now, at that same 120 that we were looking at before, whereas before they could only produce 300, now they can produce 400. Shifts the demand curve out. Changes in technology that decrease the cost of production, whether it's because the inputs get cheaper, or whether or not it just decreases the overall cost of producing the product. Both are production technologies, will shift the demand curve out. What about the number of sellers? Okay, so in our particular example before, we had two, right? We had Starbucks and we had Peet's. So Peet's and Starbucks were literally the only ones in the market. So if there's an increase in the number of sellers and we add in a third, then what happens is the quantity supplied at each price is literally going to go up. So it's going to shift the demand curve outward. This is why many economists will say that competition is good, because look at this. So if the supply curve is such that, as it was in S1 for the chocolate bar category, and all of a sudden now there's more producers in the chocolate bar, then what's happening here is that all of a sudden now we move from S1 to S2. There's more supply at any price point because there's other people making it. So at 20, whereas before there were a few producers and they were making 300. Well, if you add in a few producers, guess what? Now all of a sudden there's 400 available at 120. This allows for more and more to be available. We'll see how this is nice for the consumers in a little bit. So, expectations. Expectations are the hardest one in some ways because a little bit of it is just purely human response. And we want people to assume that they're going to act rationally. So in economics, we tend to try to assume that everything is rational. So if the Middle East is such that it's maybe there's a lot of unrest, maybe there's some shipping issues, and oil coming from the Middle East becomes more expensive because we think it's going to happen, because we see things happening in the Middle East that lead us to believe oil is going to become more expensive. People in Texas may decide not to necessarily give their supply over into the supply chain right now. They may hold that inventory and wait for prices to go up and sell it later. Now, we do a lot of this in the Midwest with corn and wheat, where we will hold until the price gets a little bit higher. So we adjust our supply that's going to be available into the market for future prices. It's a gamble, right? So chocolate bars. If we think that chocolate bar prices are going to go up in the future, manufacturers may store some of their product versus bringing it into the market. So they may artificially or purposely reduce the price, the supply right here, so there's less supply available in order to wait until prices overall have gone up or the supply has gone up, and then they can charge higher prices. Now, keep in mind, if they think price of chocolate is going to decrease in the future because of some expectation, for instance, they've seen a study that's being done, a clinical study, and they saw preliminary results and chocolate is bad for you, they may dump it and hope that they can get the best price possible. Now, the other thing that can affect supply curves is the expectations of government policy. Now, unlike consumers who worry about things like recessions, well, and I guess manufacturers do too, businesses have to worry a lot about regulation. So imagine if the government taxed every chocolate bar ever made. That would make chocolate bars more expensive because at every price point, now they would have to add that tax on. So they'd have to put that tax onto the price of the chocolate bar. This means that Chuck would produce fewer chocolate bars at each price point. And likely everybody else would, and it would shift the supply curve in. Now, on the other hand, if the government was to subsidize chocolate production, that would result in lower production prices because the government would say, for every chocolate bar you produce, I'm going to give you $10. No, that doesn't make sense because it's only $1.20. They're going to give you 10 cents. So they give you 10 cents. That makes producing that $1.20 chocolate bar 10 cents cheaper. Now all of a sudden you can produce more of them. So government uses taxes and subsidies sometimes to affect the supply chain of our products. Change in prices of other goods being produced. Okay, if a firm produces more of one good but can actually produce another, they can switch their production lines. So Chuck's Chocolate Company produces caramels. So they've got a production line for chocolate bars and a production line for caramels, right? Two different production lines. So the price of caramel candies increases. So basically everybody's getting more for their caramel candies. So what does Chuck say? I could produce more caramels and less chocolates and make more money. So what's Chuck going to do? He's going to take some of his production line that presently produces chocolates and he's going to move it over to caramels. This is actually the notion of the chassis that auto manufacturers have produced. For instance, auto manufacturer may have a luxury line like Integra, and then they may have a standard or normal line such as Honda. So what they're doing there is they're using the same chassis, but they're producing two different lines. If there's a higher demand for luxury goods, they'll use that line and produce more luxury goods. If the demand and the price point for standard, I guess, that's not the quite word, cars is higher, they produce more of the Hondas. So to summarize, price causes movement along the supply curve. Remember, so you have a supply curve just like you had a demand curve. And what's happening? If the price changes, let's say it goes down, you just produce less. Price goes up, you just produce more. Input prices actually shift the supply curve. Technology can shift it as well. The number of sellers shifts it. If there's more sellers, there's more product, right? If there's less sellers, there's less product. And expectations, a big one. And that includes, of course, the government. All right, so let's do some exercises. We're going to take a look at our nice little supply curve here, and we're going to basically pretend that we are looking at the market for tax return software. So for instance, Quicken makes a tax return software. Always very popular about February, right after the new year, really. So retailers are going to cut the price of that software. It's the first one we're going to look at. We're going to look at the technology advances, and then we're going to look at professional tax preparers. I'm going to see what happens there. So the first one, a fall in the price of tax returns. Now, we just talked about that. So anytime there's a fall in the price of the product that's supply curve you're looking at, it's just movement along the supply curve. So really what's happening here is that we used to have P1 and we used to produce quantity 1. So now all of a sudden the overall price in the market is going to be P2. That means that every producer is going to produce less. What happens if there's a fall in the cost of producing the software? So now that could be a technology advance, right? There could be a technological advance that made it easier to produce it. Maybe, for instance, when they went from producing it on CDs to you being able to buy it online and download it with a one download. That's a huge difference, right? Because now all of a sudden the packaging becomes less. You don't have to use the CDs anymore. You've come up with a secure way, or maybe you actually even have the people do it online. That would even be cheaper, right? You don't even download anything. That will shift the supply curve outward, because now at every price point, you can produce more than you could before. That will shift the supply curve to the right. See, it's going to the right or out. Right or out. I don't care which way you say it. The third one was the professional tax preparer raising their price. Well, what do you think happens? If a tax preparer raises its price, you are going to increase the demand for the good. But the truth be told, it doesn't change the supply. And when we get into equilibrium, we'll look at this a little bit more. The next part of this is going to be equilibrium, and we're going to look at basically taking the two charts and putting them together, because it's supply and demand, not or demand, right? So we'll take a look at that next. Hopefully this was clear. Take a look at all your notes. Make sure you have everything nicely and neatly put together, and I will talk to you again soon.